Hello, everyone. So today I wanted to go over social movements as you've been reading and also seeing them in the news. These are forms of challenges to power by namely by groups, individuals who come together as a collective and to advocate for some type of change. So social movements, as we see through, we're going to see some images here and try to visualize some of the movements that have gone through around globally. And here you see an image in Santiago, Chile, in South America, where students had demanded free education. This is going back within about 2011 or so. More images of Chile, people making demands that arose from the rises in prices. And this was a student-led movement who also demanded the human right to a free education in the university. And neoliberalism, I also wanted to come back to this concept of neoliberalism because it's a very popular concept that we hear, we read, we see, and it is very real. And here you see one of the student protesters in Chile stating that, holding a sign that says neoliberalism was born in Chile and it will die in Chile. So what is neoliberalism? And in general, it's an economic theory that supports free markets, limiting the role of the state, expanded privatization, deregulation, meaning the lessening of rules over labor, over environment, and eliminating public goods, all in the goal of expanding global markets. And that's it in general, but also this term arises, as you see, neo meaning new, and where we began this course thinking of the concept derived from namely John Locke, the English philosopher, on classical liberalism. And this derives its name from there and its tendencies towards such as the way we approach the market. And this is a stage in this stage of advanced global capitalism that we exist in. This is a theory that underpins how the markets operate. So it is very, very, very real to us and tangible. We're going to see. So social movement leaders, going back to thinking about who they are and going back to the past, we see many folks here. You see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Gandhi, Cesar Chavez, who led the great boycott here in California. Also in your era, we see Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee against racial injustice. But going back, this is a whole history of social movement leaders. And here you see the image of the Black Power salute going back to the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, where John Carlos and Tommy Davis, put their fist up in the air in solidarity with the injustices that were happening back home when they took gold and silver. And also interesting backstory on the gentleman that you see who received the bronze, who was also in solidarity. I believe he was from Australia. I may be mistaken, but his story, he was totally in support of what they were doing. He evidently asked for a glove to put his fist up in protest and solidarity with African Americans in the United States. But today we see these leaders, our idea of social movement leaders being one individual, changing. We see a diverse set of leaders that emerge from the grassroots, that emerge from the communities in which they engaged in. Here we are in Northern California. We have leaders everywhere. Some of you students are student leaders, are active, are advocating for certain things, whether it's gun control, whether it's the environmental protection, anything that you are advocating for, LGBTQIA plus rights. And how does social change come about when one enacts it? One of the key things when we started this course is that politics, it's power. It's who has it, who doesn't. Who has the power to construct laws and make people follow them. Who has the power to distribute resources on any level, whether it's water, whether it's milk, whether it's bread, whether it's power. Power, I mean, is an electrical power, right? Do the lights go on? Do the trains run on time? And here's a letter from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from when he was arrested and in Birmingham, the famous Birmingham jail letter that many of you probably have already read. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the point where on moderation, right, where he states, I have reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor, or the KKK, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, and who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. And I point this out because this is a tension that we see in today's movement. In your generation, post-2020, we see, after the murder of George Floyd, we see many who came to support, but also question the actions of people who were angry on the streets and who were demanding justice in their own terms. So this has been one consistent in that move towards a form of justice in any, whether it's for women, they were told, we agree with what you want, but we don't like you being out in the streets doing it. You should be at home. This is the late 19th century, women advocating for the right to vote and becoming democratic citizens in the United States. Any other groups were always told, wait. This generation is being told to wait. And that's power, right? The power to tell someone how they should resist, how they should organize, how they should launch social movements. And I'll move through these. And one notion on the political, I'll take this quote from James Baldwin, is that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Because for most, and the majority of folks in American society, and globally we can speak to, but American society, feel that nothing can be done. So they fall back into, and guess what? If you don't think you can change something, it will not change because you will not act. So that form of, you're neutralized by that idea. As we go back and through the text, I'm just going to zoom through these, through our textbook, some of these movements that we see from miners striking in 1917. This is labor, falls under the auspice of labor rights. And this is when people enact democratic citizenship. Right? We can say you're not a citizen just by being born, although you are under the 14th Amendment, birth by soil. You become a U.S. citizen, but democratic citizenship enacts something more. We have obligations, right? So we consent under the social contract that we read through in our opening chapters. You have rights, but you also have obligations. We also have obligations to contribute to society in some way, shape, or form. So now, how do social movements come? What are they? Right? So your textbook definition is they are sustained challenge to those in power put forth by individuals acting with others who have been excluded from the political process. Think back to the concept of inegalitarianism, the tradition of the exclusion of large segments of society over time. I mentioned, indigenous peoples who the attempts to wipe them away, they were not enabled to become citizens until 1924. We had women, you had poor white males who were not citizens up until the mid-19th century, close to the mid-19th century, around the 1830s or so. And other racialized groups that entered, and also new groups, racialized groups that entered the U.S. polity, who became, their treatment was more afforded to those of second-class citizens, as many claim. So when you don't have power, you make demands for it, right? You make demands for resources. They are instruments of political outsiders. They're grassroots. And they come together, say we all had a shared grievance, We all agree something is wrong. We come together and let's do something about it. How are we going to do it? You have to disrupt. You have to be disruptive. That's the essence of gaining attention. People who advocate for change, they don't follow the rules of who is oppressing them, right? Although those who are control the levers of power do want you to follow their rules when you resist. Go ask for a permit so you can march down the street. Do it the right way, quote unquote. And that's not what grassroots activists are really trying to do. Successful ones, successful, I say in quotes, because what does that mean? Turn into interest groups that do have a say in Washington, D.C. Think of the National Organization of Women that emerged from the movements of the 1960s, early 70s, advocating for women's rights, and now they have offices. So the origins of social movements are, there's a real perceived distress, you have resources to mobilize, and you have support. And the belief that you as an individual can create change. If you believe that you cannot enact change, you have been neutralized. We have been neutralized to maintain the status quo, to maintain law and order for our security. But those who do believe that they can affect change make a calculated assessment and enter the fray. Let's go. Let's get things done. Let's advocate for whatever we're advocating for, whether it's racial justice, whether it's any form of injustice that we seek to end, and you believe you make a change, you enter the fray. So measuring successful movements, we see that those who hold goals to American values similar, and I say that broadly, I'm just going off some general points here. The capacity to win attention and public support, and the ability to affect the political fortunes of elected leaders. Politicians are politicians, meaning they're opportunists. If they believe that a movement can assist them in maintaining their form of power or gain re-election, they will lend their support. If they feel it will harm them, more than likely, not all the time, but more than likely, they will opt out. Remember, politicians are not movement leaders. They are politicians, as we see. And what does that mean when I say that politicians? That we know that most people in American society hold a negative view of politicians, who are maybe some seek out. And we see that, why? Because so much corruption in politics, and people tend to become jaded with that view. And here is a Dolores Huerta, who was also one of the female leadership of the United Farm Workers, and it's still advocating. I highlight her because she's still out there as we speak, advocating for justice, specific, not only for farm workers here in California, but around the nation, and for a slew of other forms of injustice. Here's a young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. being arrested. And what is civil disobedience? So by definition, it is you are intentionally breaking a law in order to highlight how unjust that law is. Right? So just think to some of the imagery when people were trying to desegregate lunch counters. Black people would go and sit at the lunch counter, demand to be served. They were violating a policy, whether spoken, unspoken, written, but they were breaking it in order to highlight how unjust it was. Okay. So some of those forms, that enacted forms of civil disobedience, women's rights, and this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions in 1848. And you see what I've highlighted here is women are also created equal. That's my emphasis. But the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of men toward women, having in direct object the establishment of a direct tyranny over her. So that can lead to contemporary forms of unequal pay. We know the United States women's soccer team just won a years-long battle to gain equal pay as the men's national soccer team, right? That's just one example. So moving through these movements throughout U.S. history into the civil rights movements of the 1960s, through the Chicano movements, through the anti-war against Vietnam, people protesting anti-war Iraq in 2000.